I never thought I'd be the kind of mother-in-law who interfered in her son's marriage. I raised him to be independent, taught him to make his own choices, and when he finally brought someone home, really brought someone home, not just a casual dinner guest, but someone he wanted to spend his life with, I told myself I would smile, welcome her, and keep my opinions to myself. That lasted about 40 minutes into Christmas dinner. My son's name is Brandon. He's 34, works in project management for a construction firm out of Mississauga, and he has his father's jaw and my stubborn streak, which I say with love and with the full awareness that it has caused us both a great deal of grief over the years. His father passed 7 years ago. Heart attack, very sudden, the kind that doesn't give you time to say what you need to say. And since then it's been the two of us navigating holidays and milestones in that careful, tender way that people do when they've lost someone who used to be the centre of gravity. So when Brandon called me in October to say he was bringing someone to Christmas, that he wanted me to meet her properly, that it was serious, I cried a little after I hung up, happy tears, the kind you feel slightly embarrassed about but don't regret. Her name was Tessa. She arrived at my door in Oakville on the 24th, holding a bottle of Ontario ice wine and a small poinsettia, and my first thought was that she had kind eyes. Dark brown, very still, the sort of eyes that make you feel like you're being listened to even before you've said anything. She was maybe 28, slight, with her hair in a loose braid over one shoulder. She shook my hand and said, "Thank you so much for having me. Brandon talks about you constantly." And she said it in a way that felt genuine, not the rehearsed warmth of someone performing for a boyfriend's mother, but something quieter and more real. Brandon came in behind her, carrying a bag of gifts, and wearing the particular expression he gets when he's trying to look casual and failing completely. My boy. He hugged me too hard and I let him. I'd invited my sister as well. She lives in Burlington and she and Brandon have always been close, and her husband and their teenage son, who spent most of the evening on his phone, which I've decided is simply the natural state of 15-year-olds and not worth fighting. We had tourtière, because we always have tourtière on Christmas Eve, and a green salad and the mashed potatoes my late husband's mother used to make, with an amount of butter that I'm fairly certain would have alarmed his cardiologist. For the first hour, everything was lovely. Tessa helped me carry dishes from the kitchen without being asked. She talked to my sister easily, asked my brother-in-law about his work, even managed to draw the teenager into a brief but genuine conversation about hockey. Brandon watched her with this soft, private pride that I recognized because his father used to look at me that way in the early years, and something in my chest loosened in a way it hadn't in a long time. I was at the kitchen counter slicing the tortilla when I heard Brandon's phone go off in the other room. He'd left it on the sideboard near the door. I noticed, because I'd almost knocked it off when I was hanging coats. I wasn't paying attention to it. I was focused on making sure the pastry didn't crumble, which is always the risk with tourtière if you don't let it rest long enough. Then I heard it go off again, and again. 3 times in quick succession, that urgent little cluster of notifications that means someone is sending messages fast, one after another. Tessa had gone to the bathroom. My sister was refilling wine glasses. I glanced at the phone without meaning to, the way you do when something is blinking in your peripheral vision, and the screen was lit up with a preview of the messages before it locked. "Where are you?" I said, "Where are you?" "Why aren't you answering?" The name at the top of the thread was Brandon's. He was in the living room, Tessa was in the bathroom down the hall, and he was sending her, from 15 feet away, in the same house, at Christmas dinner, 3 messages demanding to know where she was and why she wasn't answering. I stood there with the serving knife in my hand and felt something cold move through me. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself there was context I didn't have. I told myself that young people communicate differently, that couples have their own languages, that I was a 63-year-old woman who hadn't been in a relationship in 7 years, and perhaps I didn't understand how things worked anymore. I carried the tourtière to the table and sat down and smiled and poured myself a glass of water and said nothing. But I watched. I watched the way Tessa came back to the table and picked up her phone and read the messages and then set it face down beside her plate. A small, careful gesture, the kind you make when you don't want anyone to see your reaction. I watched the way Brandon's posture changed when she sat back down, a subtle relaxation, like a fist unclenching. I watched her reach for the salt and catch his eyes first, a quick involuntary glance, like someone checking whether it was allowed. I've been a nurse for 35 years. I spent the last 15 of my career in the emergency department at a hospital in Hamilton before I retired. I have seen things that I will carry for the rest of my life, things I don't talk about at dinner tables. But the specific skill that work gives you, the skill I didn't fully appreciate until I left, is the ability to read a body, not just the clinical signs, the pulse and the pressure and the color of the skin, but the subtler language. The way someone holds their shoulders when they're in pain, they're trying to hide. The way someone's eyes move when they're calculating how to answer a question. The way someone who is afraid moves differently from someone who is simply nervous. Tessa was afraid. Not in an obvious way. She laughed at the right moments. She complimented my tourtière. She talked about her job. She worked in graphic design, had her own small client base, mostly small businesses and non-profits. And she was funny and warm and clearly intelligent. But underneath all of it, there was a watchfulness that I recognized, an alertness, the kind that doesn't come from excitement or happiness, but from long practice in monitoring someone else's mood. Brandon, for his part, was charming. He always has been. He laughed and told stories and kept one hand on the back of Tessa's chair, which looked affectionate from across the table, and might have looked affectionate to anyone who wasn't paying attention to the way her spine straightened slightly every time his fingers moved. After dinner, while my sister and her husband were helping clear the plates, I asked Tessa if she wanted to see the garden. Even in December, there's not much to see in a Canadian garden, mostly dormant perennials and whatever the squirrels haven't destroyed. But I have a small enclosed sunroom at the back of the house that I've filled with plants, and it's warm, and it's separate from the rest of the house in a way that felt important in that moment. She said she'd love to. We sat in the wicker chairs with our tea, and she admired my amaryllis, which had just opened, very red, very extravagant, exactly the kind of overwrought beauty that December calls for. I didn't ask her anything right away. I've learned over the years that the fastest way to get someone to close up is to walk straight at them with a question. So I talked about the amaryllis. I talked about how my late husband had given me the bulb years ago as a joke, because I'd told him I was terrible with houseplants, and how I'd managed to keep it alive, and it bloomed every single winter, and how I'd stopped thinking of it as a joke and started thinking of it as something else. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's a really lovely way to think about it." I said, "How long have you and Brandon been together?" "Almost 2 years," she said, and something flickered across her face. Not unhappiness exactly, but a complicated thing. The expression of someone doing arithmetic they're not sure comes out right. I said, "He seems very happy." She nodded. She was holding her mug with both hands, looking at the amaryllis. I said gently, "Are you?" The pause before she answered was about 3 seconds long. That was all. But in the emergency department, 3 seconds is a very long time. "Of course," she said. "Of course I am." I didn't push. I wasn't going to push that night. But before we went back inside, I touched her hand and I said, "My number is in Brandon's phone. If you ever need anything, anything at all, you're welcome to use it." She looked at me with those still, dark eyes, and something passed between us that I couldn't quite name, but that I felt in the way you feel the moment before weather changes. I didn't sleep well that Christmas Eve. I lay in my bedroom and listened to the house settle. Brandon and Tessa were in the guest room. My sister and her family had driven back to Burlington, and I went over everything I'd seen. I tried to talk myself out of it. I thought about how easy it is to misread things, how dangerous it is to project, how much damage a well-meaning person can do with the wrong interpretation. I thought about how Brandon was my son, and how the idea that he could be hurting someone, not with his fists. I wasn't thinking that, but in the other ways, the quieter ways that are harder to see and harder to prove, was not something I was prepared to hold. But I kept coming back to those 3 messages. "Where are you?" I said, "Where are you? Why aren't you answering?" Not, "Hey, everything okay?" Not just checking in. Not even a question mark, which sounds like a small thing but isn't. A question mark makes it a question. Without it, it's something else. It's an instruction. It's a demand that the other person account for themselves. In the morning I made pancakes and we opened gifts and everything was surface normal, in the way that a held breath is normal. Technically correct. Unsustainable. I watched Tessa open the gift I'd gotten her, a scarf from a shop in downtown Oakville that I'd chosen carefully, and she thanked me with a warmth that felt genuine. I watched Brandon watch me watching her, and I made sure my face showed nothing. They left on the 26th. Brandon hugged me at the door and said, "She loves you, Mum, I can tell." I said I loved her too, which was not a lie. I did, already, in the way you love someone you can see is trying very hard to hold something together that is heavier than it should be. Tessa hugged me and I felt her hold on a moment longer than necessary. I said quietly into her hair, "Remember what I said?" She nodded once and pulled back, and her eyes were very bright. I spent the next 3 weeks trying to decide what to do. I want to be honest about that period, because I think people imagine that when something is wrong, you simply act. You see the thing, you name the thing, you fix the thing, but it's not like that, especially when the person at the center of it is your child. I called a former colleague of mine. She'd done a lot of work with a domestic abuse organization in Hamilton over the years, and I told her what I'd observed without naming anyone. She was very careful and very clear with me. She said that what I was describing, the monitoring, the mood checking, the hypervigilance in someone else's presence, were all consistent with patterns she recognized. She said the most important thing was not to act in a way that would put Tessa in danger. She said that often when an outsider interferes too directly, it makes things worse in the short term. She said the most powerful thing I could do was make sure Tessa knew she had somewhere to go. She also gave me the number for the Assaulted Women's Helpline, which operates across Ontario, and the name of a shelter coordinator in the Mississauga area. I sat with that information for a long time. In February, Tessa texted me. Not a call. A text, which I understood. A call can be heard. A text can be deleted before anyone sees it. The message was brief. She asked if she could come for tea sometime, maybe a Saturday when Brandon was doing the hockey pool thing he did with his friends from work. I wrote back that I would love that, and I gave her 2 dates, and she chose one. She arrived at 2:30 on a Saturday in February, and the moment I opened the door, I saw what she'd been carrying since Christmas. She looked tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. Her eyes were still kind, but there were shadows under them, and she moved through my doorway with the careful precision of someone who has learned to take up as little space as possible. We sat in the kitchen. I made tea. I didn't say anything for a while. I let her hold her cup and look out the window at the back garden, which was deep in snow, and I waited. She said, "I don't know how to say this." I said, "You don't have to say anything perfectly, just say it however it comes." What came out over the next hour was not a single dramatic story. It was a collection of small things, which is how it always is. The way he tracked her location on her phone and would text immediately if she was somewhere unexpected. The way he would go very quiet when she spent time with her friends. Not angry, just quiet. And then later there would be a conversation about how she'd made him feel left out, how he just worried about her, how she was all he had. The way she'd gradually stopped seeing those friends because the conversations afterward were exhausting. And she'd started to feel, without quite knowing when it had happened, that it was easier to just stay home. The way he reviewed her work, her freelance clients, and had opinions about which ones she should take, which relationships were professional and which seemed unnecessary. The way she'd stopped trusting her own perception of things, because every time she raised something, there was an explanation, there was a reframe, and somehow she always ended up apologizing. "He's never hit me," she said. "I want to be clear about that." I said, "I know." She looked at me. "Does that make it less real?" I said, "No, it makes it harder to see, but not less real." She started to cry then, not dramatically, just a quiet leaking, the kind that happens when you've been holding something for too long and someone finally says the thing out loud that you haven't been able to say yourself. I went to the drawer where I'd put the phone numbers and I slid them across the table to her. I told her about the Assaulted Women's Helpline. I told her about the shelter coordinator. I told her that what she was experiencing had a name and that the name mattered, not because it changed what she felt, but because naming it correctly meant she could stop wondering if she was imagining it. I told her she was not imagining it. We talked for a long time about practical things. She had her own freelance income, which was important. Financial independence matters enormously in these situations, and she hadn't lost that, though she'd let some clients go. She had a close friend in Brampton, someone from university, who she'd drifted from but who had texted her recently out of the blue. She had her parents in Charlottetown, who she hadn't told anything but who she missed. She had more than she thought she had. I want to be clear about something. I did not tell her what to do. I have made that mistake before in my life. Not in a situation like this, but the specific arrogance of deciding you know what's best for someone else and acting accordingly, and I wasn't going to make it here. What I did was make sure she had information. What I did was make sure she knew that whatever she decided, there were people who would help her, and that I was one of them. She stayed until nearly 6. Before she left, she stood in my hallway and looked at me and said, "If I do something, if I decide to leave, will you tell Brandon?" I said, "No." She said, "He'll ask you." I said, "I know." She said, "He'll be angry." I said, "I know that too." She hugged me then, and I held on, and I thought about my late husband and the things you can't save, and the things you can, and I thought about my son, my complicated, wounded son who had grown up watching his father love me well and had somehow, somewhere, learned a different lesson, and I let myself grieve that for a moment, quietly, and then I let it go. In March, Tessa left. She didn't tell me when it was happening. She was smart not to, because if I didn't know, I couldn't accidentally let something slip. Not that I would have, but she was protecting herself as thoroughly as she could, and I respected that. What I got was a text message at 9 in the evening on a Thursday. "I'm safe. Thank you." 2 sentences. That was all I needed. Brandon called me the next morning. I'd been expecting it. He was not calm. He wanted to know if I'd heard from her, if I knew where she was, if I'd helped her. I told him I wasn't going to discuss Tessa's whereabouts. He said, "Mum, I'm worried about her." I said, "I believe she's safe." He said, "What does that mean?" "What do you know?" I said. "Brandon, I love you. I will always love you. But I'm not going to help you find her." The silence on the other end of the phone was very long. Then he said, "Did she tell you things about me?" I said, "I think you should talk to someone, a therapist, someone trained for this specifically. I can help you find a name if you want one." He hung up. He called back 4 days later and said he wanted to talk. He came to Oakville on a Sunday and we sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen, and it was one of the hardest conversations I have ever had in my life, and I have had hard conversations. I told him carefully and without cruelty what I had observed, not what Tessa had told me, that was hers, but what I had seen with my own eyes. The messages on Christmas Eve, the way she moved around him, what 35 years of clinical work had taught me to recognize. He cried. He was angry. He was defensive. He said things he later apologized for. He came back 3 more times over the following weeks, and each time we talked for a long time, and each time I watched something shift. Not completely, not all at once, but the way ice shifts in early April, that first softening that doesn't look like much but is the beginning of everything. He started seeing a therapist in April. He found her through a men's program in Mississauga that works specifically with people who've been controlling in their relationships. I didn't find her for him. That mattered. I hear from Tessa occasionally. Brief messages. She moved back closer to her parents. She's picked up a new client she's excited about. She went to her university friend's birthday party in Brampton last month and said it felt like breathing again. She doesn't owe me those messages. I treasure them anyway. My son and I are still finding our way back to each other, which is a thing I didn't know was possible 6 months ago. It's slow. It should be slow. He is doing the work, which is all I can ask. And some days I look at him and see the boy who used to fall asleep in the car on the way home from hockey practice, and I think that people are not only the worst things they've done. Some days that's harder to believe than others. What I know, sitting here in my sunroom in May with the amaryllis long finished and the garden finally waking up, is this: I would do it again. Every hard conversation, every sleepless night, every moment of sitting with the grief of what my son had become and choosing to see Tessa clearly anyway. I would do all of it again without a second's hesitation. Because when I think of her face at my door in February, the exhaustion in it, the way she had learned to make herself small, and then I think of her message in March, I'm safe. There is no version of the story where I could have looked away and still lived with myself. I am 63 years old. I was a nurse for 35 years. I have held the hands of people in the worst moments of their lives. I know, better than most, that sometimes the bravest thing isn't the loud action. Sometimes the gravest thing isn't the loud action. Sometimes it's the quiet one. The cup of tea, the folded piece of paper with 2 phone numbers, the hand on someone's arm, and the words spoken low enough that only she can hear, "You are not imagining it." That's all it was, and it was enough. I keep thinking about that amaryllis, the one my husband gave me as a joke because I'd told him I couldn't keep anything alive, and how it came back every winter anyway, steady and red and completely indifferent to my doubts about it. I think that's what Tessa reminded me of in the end. Not fragile, just waiting for the right conditions. What happened in my kitchen over those months wasn't dramatic. There were no confrontations, no ultimatums, no moments that would make for good television. It was cups of tea and careful words and a folded piece of paper slid across a table. And yet I've come to believe that those quiet things carry more weight than we give them credit for. That the choices we make when no one is watching, when there's nothing obvious to gain and quite a lot to lose, are the ones that actually define us. I think about the cause and effect of it. Brandon didn't become who he was overnight, and Tessa didn't find herself isolated overnight either. These things accumulate. A small control here, a quiet withdrawal there, and before long a pattern has formed that feels like the shape of normal life because it's all you can see from inside it. What I understood from 35 years of watching people in crisis is that the moment things change is rarely the dramatic one. It's the small moment. The cup of tea offered without judgment, the phone number written down and passed across without pressure. The words, "You are not imagining it," those words cost me nothing, and I think they may have changed everything. I won't pretend I handled Brandon perfectly. There were things I said in that first phone call that I wish I'd said differently. less as his mother and more as someone who simply needed him to hear the truth. But I had to trust that honesty, delivered with love and without cruelty, was the most useful thing I had to offer him. Not protection from consequences, not excuses, just clarity and the name of a therapist and the willingness to sit across from him and not look away. That's the thing I want to say if I'm being honest about what I've learned from this. Integrity isn't comfortable. Knowing the right thing and doing it are two very different actions, and the distance between them can feel enormous when the person involved is your own child. It took something. I won't call it courage exactly. It felt more like stubbornness, or maybe just the particular clarity that comes from having spent a lifetime watching what happens when people don't speak up, to choose Tessa's safety over my son's comfort. But that choice was also, in the long run, the most loving thing I could have done for him, because what he needed was not someone to look away. What he needed was someone who wouldn't. Tessa is building something new now. Brandon is doing the slow, unglamorous work of understanding himself. And I'm here in my sunroom in May, watching the garden come back, thinking about what it means to see something clearly and act on what you see. Not because it's easy, but because you've decided that's the kind of person you are going to be. That decision, I've found, is the only one that matters, and you get to make it over and over again every single day.